Her life was terrible. She had become extremely desperate. And in spite of all of the protocol of society, she pressed her way, defiled as she was, in the crowd, believing if she could just touch the hem of his garment, she would be made well. She dismissed the fact that the crowd might well have stoned her for her appearance, that her being one who troubled the master could have brought severe beating. And yet, in her desperation, she pressed forward and she touched the hem of his garment. And you remember the words of our Lord as he turns and he says to her, "Who touched me?" And the disciples standing around said, "Well, Lord, they're pressing against you from all sides. What do you mean, who touched me?" "No, someone touched me. I felt the power go out." And then he caught the eyes of the woman who had for 12 years had a horrible issue of blood, had ongoing bleeding that could not be remedied with prayer or medication. And when Jesus looked into her desperate eyes and saw the fear that was there because not only of the occurrence, but because of the attention that was brought to her, what did he say? He said, "I've got it." You say, "Well, that's not what the translation says, Pastor." Well, it depends on which translation you read. One says, "Be of good cheer." Another says, "Take courage." But I say, Jesus said, "I've got it." What does that mean when God says, take courage? Go with me to the text this morning in the book of Acts. A lengthy passage beginning in the 30th verse of chapter 22 and going all the way through the 23rd chapter. A message simply entitled, "I've Got It," or "God's Got It." Be sure you remember, out of your pride and arrogance and self-righteousness, as I am reminded to remember the same out of mine, it isn't gotten unless God's got it. Notice what Paul records for us here through Dr. Luke in verse 11. The following night, the Lord, this would be God himself, Jesus, the Lord, stood near Paul and he said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. I am with you, and I will see you through." Take courage. This morning, let me encourage you to give it to God, because I can promise you He's got it. Pray with me. Father, today we come as needy people to a forgiving and giving God. Brother Rudy was so right as he reminded us this morning, it isn't fair. And Father, I want to praise you that you are not a God that considers fairness in the equation. For you go beyond what is fair to do that which is gracious and merciful. And Lord, we come today needing, as this lady with the issue of blood, as the Apostle Paul in our story needed, and as every man and woman on planet Earth needs, and that is a touch of the certainty that in the midst of our desperation, in the midst of our severe circumstances, you've got it. I pray that we would see and understand that today through Christ Jesus, my Lord. Amen. verse 30 of chapter 22 in the book of Acts, picks up our story from last week. It simply says, the next day. The next day. Well, it sometimes seems like a long time, doesn't it, between yesterday and today. You ever had one of those kind of days where it seemed the day would never be over? I got to thinking about that next day. I thought about the report that Paul brought to the believers in Jerusalem after all of that warning and all of that restricting, and yet he brought the report, and the report was received with approval. And immediately it turned from being approved to an atmosphere of fear. But there are folks who think the wrong things. They think the wrong things for the wrong reasons. And so you need to do something in order to show them that they're wrong. You know, I always wonder what happens in the pulpit when the preacher quits preaching about the fact that salvation is by grace through faith and not of yourselves. You know, a lot of times the problems in your life and mine are simply the result of the fact we won't release them, knowing and believing that God's got it. And so they believed, because of what was being stirred up among the Judaizers about Paul and his ministry, that they needed to do something to appease. And I can promise you, anytime you put your hands on it and I put my hands on it and we begin to manipulate it, it's going to be a mess. The end result was Paul was being beaten and he has to be rescued from the midst. That's what happened before the next day. He gets to make a personal appeal. He is accused of violating by the crowd, the people, the principles, and the place of all Judaism, when he's simply trying to do nothing but follow the advice of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem and go through a purification rite. So he appears and looks like one who follows the law the way the Judaizers want him to follow the law. But I can promise you, folks, when someone doesn't like you and they put you under a microscope, they are going to find what they need to dismiss you and discredit you. So don't take it in your hands. God's got it. Oh, if we as a church could learn that. If we as individuals could learn that. And it says, the next day. The day after the accusations. The day after the assumptions. The day after the attempted assassination. The next day. Kind of loads that phrase up a little bit, doesn't it? You ever had one of those kind of days? Where people were wanting to kill you? Where people didn't like you? Where people were saying things about you that weren't so? When you felt powerless in the midst of the accusation and the attempts to discredit? I've had those days. And I'm telling you, I'm real glad God's got it. Aren't you? Well, back to our text. The next day, since the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priest and the Sanhedrin to assemble. If you're from Alabama, Sanhedrin. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. The first point of the message today, if you are following your outline, and I hope you are. If not, let me give you a moment to find your worship guide. I know you have it, so hold it up so I can see it. You know, this is when I catch all the men that don't want to take notes. Okay, hold it up. Did Ron hold his up back there, Brenda? Oh, okay. Ron's looking on. Here we go. All right. The first point is assumption. All conflict always begins with assumption. So states McSwain and Treadwell in their book, Conflict Management in the Church. You know, I'm always surprised at people who are surprised that there are problems in the church. You know, because is it not a fact that when you have church, you have people? Right? And when you have people, you have problems. And when you have problems, you have conflict. And folks, what we're here about is to love one another, which means we hold one another responsible for all those things in order that we might find a constructive conclusion to the conflicts. That's what church is about. And by the way, that's why you and I need to be here. So don't you be fooled that you don't have problems. And don't forget, this is the place where if the love of God is as it should be, that conflict finds constructive resolution. Boy, they had some assumptions going on. I got to thinking about the commander. He looked up and this Jew comes in from out of town. He's not a good-looking Jew. There's nothing about Paul that would ever make you think he was anybody or that he knew anything. And all of a sudden, the entire town is upside down over the Apostle Paul being present. This guy is a Gentile and a heathen who's responsible for crowd control in Jerusalem. That's why the Roman Caesar placed him there as the commander. And he looks up, and what assumption does he make? This guy must have done something wrong. You ever find yourself on the side of the crowd? You know, you think because of this or that, well, there must be some truth to it. You want me to tell you how I know that you believe that? Where there's smoke, see? Where there's smoke, there's fire. The assumption of the commander, he just could not believe that the energy that was in it. In fact, if you look back in the last chapter in 34 and 35, what you'll find, they were telling him this and that, which means when he looked up and the town was upside down, he began to ask questions. Who is this guy and what's going on? And one of them said something about him leading some kind of an insurrection in Egypt. And of course, when Paul speaks to the commander in formal Greek, with a sense of sophistication that he never expected, he said, "Aren't you that guy?" And Paul says, "No. I don't know anything about Egypt. I've never been there." Well, assumptions. The commander makes assumptions, but so do the crowd. You know, the Jews that wanted to get rid of Jesus, these are the folks who put you under the microscope. They stirred up the crowd. How does that happen in a Baptist church? As a matter of fact, how does that happen in any church? Sometimes it happens in committee meetings. Sometimes it happens out there in the hallway or over here in the doors of the Sunday school classes or on the phone during the week. They stirred up the crowd. What did they tell the crowd? They told the crowd something that they knew that when they heard it, they would be upset. This Paul says that the ways of Moses are no longer necessary for Christians. In fact, what you find out is that he has violated our place. He's violated the teachings of our people, and he doesn't follow the principles. The Ten Commandments. He's taught this stuff called grace by faith. Why, you know, he said they didn't even have to be circumcised. They don't have to take the sign of the covenant. Now, did the church know this? Yes, that's why they said, you need to look like the real thing. So they used a diversionary method to try to convince the folks of what the people who wanted Paul dead was not going to accept. So they stirred up the crowd. And the crowd, being Jews, believed that if a person stood against our people, our holy place, the temple, and our principles, he needs to die. And so that's what they set out to do, to kill him. In fact, when the commander went in and retrieved Paul, they were literally trying to beat him to death. Well, then there are the co-conspirators. This is the group of Jews who came from Asia, conspiring with Ananias. And let me stop, and I know y'all probably got this, but I kind of let this slip for a lot of years. You know, in this story, it talks about the fact that Paul didn't know who the high priest was. And then you look there and you say, well, the high priest's name is Ananias. Well, that sounds a lot like Annas, doesn't it? Annas was the high priest when Jesus was crucified. Ananias is now the high priest. Not the same person. Paul's been gone for a lot of years, and he was speaking correctly when he says, I didn't know it was the high priest. And I thought, well, how could he not know? It's the same guy that's been the high priest. He was on staff, you know, back when he was persecuting the church. And just one or two vowels difference in the name. But it is two different people. But the co-conspirators in their assumption, they assume that if they can stir up the crowd with the blessing of the Sanhedrin, then they can do away with Paul. But guess what? God had it. The second point, they moved from assumption to manipulation. Why do we do that? Because when we make an assumption about our reality, it becomes fact. That's why assumption is so dangerous. People look up and they think this, they think that, based on what they have concluded, when if they would follow through, they would find out that the facts are anything other than what they've come to believe the facts to be. But when they make the assumption and they want to follow through with their assumption as fact, then they begin to manipulate. How did the commander do this? He's still convinced Paul's done something. How does he manipulate? He releases him. I'm no longer responsible. Kind of like the parallel. Wash my hands of this. You know? Y'all remember a guy named Pilate doing that? But he then took a further step, and by the empowerment given to him, he called the Sanhedrin together. And when the Sanhedrin came together, all 70 of them, he took Paul and he put them in the midst so that they could try him under their law. And he backed over here and he watched. You ever been manipulated like that? You ever feel like somebody draw a bullseye on you, the target? Am I just talking to me? Y'all never felt like that? Maybe as the preacher, you get a little bit more of that kind of activity than others. But I'm telling you, if you've never felt like somebody just... Now, we have a saying, they hung you out to dry. I don't know if y'all say that in the north, but we say that in the south. You know, I mean, that means all of a sudden, you're left out there by yourself. We even have a strong biblical story of that, don't we? What did David do when he got caught with his hand in the cookie jar? Did he not take Uriah the Hittite, send him to the front line, and give his commanding general the order in the thick of the battle? Do what? Withdraw from him. Can you imagine fighting a bunch of folks with swords and spears? I mean, maybe several hundred. And all of a sudden, everybody that is beside you has backed up 10 or 15 yards behind you. Ever felt like that? Ever had that happen to you? Well, that's what went on. They withdrew to a safe place, but later you'll notice they go and they have to withdraw Paul again. So his manipulation didn't work. What about the manipulation of the co-conspirators? Well, they thought if they could get him in the court and they could get him sentenced by the high priest, then their efforts could be legitimized. First thing Paul says when he walks into the court is, you don't have any business saying that to me. I have and here's what he said, a clear conscience. That means that which comes alongside to agree. Now, when you go to consciousness, as he does here, there are several things that you need to learn about consciousness. You can have a good conscience, and that's what Paul said he had about everything that he was doing and everything he had said about who he was both as a believer and a Jew, or you could have a defiled conscience. That's when you and I use our sin to justify that what is wrong is right in order that we can choose to do it. And then if you continue to live with a defiled conscience, you'll develop another kind of consciousness the Bible speaks of called an evil conscience. Not only will you do wrong, but you will seek to destroy anybody who does right. Thus, 2,000 years ago, a bunch of folks with evil conscience, just like you and me, nailed Jesus to the cross. So, the co-conspirators did their manipulation. And I really wanted to say, but a cunning philosopher, because then I had all three C's with ing. You know, but I went and looked the word up, and cunning has with it a sense of deception, and Paul was not deceptive. And so I had to move to the root, to the word shrewd. This is a person who is very wise in evaluating what's going on around him and makes a calculated decision that brings about a positive effect. So Paul, realizing once he's been slapped, once he sees that everything is against him, he uses his circumstances and he says, I want to tell you, folks, the only reason, listen to this manipulation, that I stand here before you today is because I believe in the resurrection. Wow. What did Paul know? And I can tell by the blank looks on your faces, he knew something most of y'all don't know. The Sadducees believed there was no resurrection. There were no angels. There were no spirits. None of that stuff. And the other side of that 70 were Pharisees, and they believed in all of that stuff. And so instead of them focusing on Paul, they got to fighting one another. Isn't it interesting how that occurs in church? A person can become a focal point. And it isn't but a little while till that person's no longer the focal point, and everybody's fighting one another. And we call that what? A church split. That's why we have Second and Third Baptist churches. Anybody with any good sense knows that the piano goes on the left side instead of the right side. You're going to have problems with it. You're going to have to move that over there. You see, God can't speak and move in a worship service when the piano's, and you know, what a sacrilegious thing you did, putting a keyboard on top of a grand piano. Now, you laugh about that, but I'm going to tell you, there was a day when Dennis Rader did that, and I thought somebody was going to skin him alive. Yeah, isn't it good? Isn't it good? And you know what else? You do play both of them. Oh, goodness. Are we not a part of the story? Manipulation. So they got in a fuss with one another. In fact, they moved from accusing Paul to the side of the Pharisees, defending him and saying he hadn't done anything wrong. And when he saw there was going to be a fight, that person who had manipulated the whole meeting went in there and yanked Paul out. Wow, what a story. Did y'all get all that when you read this? I mean, it was a great happening. But how does the manipulation find itself overcome? Because God, in the midst of your sinfulness and mine, has got it. Then notice the next thing. It's the key verse today, revelation. We move from assumption to manipulation to revelation. Notice the text in verse 11. Jesus speaks. Take courage, Paul. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. Now, we're going to have some strong practical points from that to close out this sermon, but I want to look at this in three ways now, this revelation. First, that revelation was very personal. Paul needed to have his spirit encouraged. Do you ever get so far down and so far away that if you don't have hope, you're not going to make it? That's what courage gave Paul's heart. It gave his heart hope. Have you ever felt like nobody understood, and in that moment in the prayer closet, God says, I've got it. I know exactly what's going on. Son, I tell you what, when I get to that place, and there have been some times when I've gotten to that place, I can tell you what this preacher believes. If God is for us, who can be against us? If he didn't spare his own son but gave him up freely for us all, will he not give us all things? And when I know God is on my side, I don't care who's on the other side of the line, because he's got it. He's got it. It was very personal. But it was also theological. You see, he confirmed Paul's call. He confirmed that what he was doing in Paul was fulfilling his very will. If you go back to the first chapter, in the 8th verse, it says, you shall be witnesses unto me in Jerusalem, in Judea, and in Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the world. Paul had been all those first three places, and now, by God's hand, in a really unusual way, he is headed straight to Rome. And from there, the voice of Christianity will be heard by the entire world. Oh, take courage, folks. God's got it. Personally, he's got it. Theologically, he's got it. He has come to seek and to save those which are lost. And folks, when we know that, it ought to settle. We don't need anything else. That's why we want to have here simple church. Bring people to Christ. Grow them in spiritual growth. And then send them out to serve. And when we've got that, the rest of it really doesn't matter. You know, but people always have trouble with that. Well, Lord, tell us about the temple. What's going to happen? And Jesus says, I don't know. Only the Father knows. That's not really something you need to get that involved with. Get out there. The fields are white unto harvest. People need their lives revolutionized by what the transforming power of God can do. Be about that. That's spiritual growth. That is spiritual depth. When you're doing and not hearing. Oh, folks, we get so twisted in the world today by those who tickle our ears with fancy. And God says in this word of revelation, it's personal, it's theological. In fact, what I am doing, Paul, is providential. Don't you call that fate? God enters history in your life and mine, and He makes the way straight. Providential means divine foresight and intervention. God looked up and He knew what He was going to do in the life of Paul. And so He set the circumstances in midst of assumptions and manipulation, and He revealed Himself and showed His providential presence. Now, it's fun to watch how He did that. Notice the fourth point: protection. It didn't work the first time. They didn't get him when they were beating him. It didn't work the second time. They didn't get Paul when he was standing before them, placed there by the commander. And so 40 of them decide, they take an oath. I consider it to be a strong oath. Y'all want to know why? They weren't going to eat. And after that, it didn't matter, or sleep until they killed him. That's pretty serious. Man, when I start telling you, I'm not going to eat or sleep until I get this done, the best thing for you to do is get out of my way. Or shoot me. Because when I get into that mode, I'm serious. I'm making some fun here, but they were serious. They put their physical life on the line, and they said, here's what we want you to do. You tell them we don't have enough information. Call the commander, tell him to bring Paul back in here, and before he ever gets into the temple, we're going to kill him. We're going to kill him. The only problem was, Paul's nephew. Isn't it just like God? Paul's nephew hears the conversation. And you know what his nephew did? He went straight to Paul. Paul says to the centurion who's in charge of him while he's imprisoned in the barracks, take this young man to the commander. And the commander, just notice this. I can see him putting his arm around that young boy and said, come on over here and let's talk. You know why he did that? Because he knew that people, when they hear talk. He didn't want anybody to hear what that boy had to say. So he put his arm around him, brought him over. He says, now tell me what you heard. He said, there's 40 of them that's taken an oath. And under a pretense, they're asking to bring Paul back in for more information. And they're going to kill him before he gets there. Boy, I'm telling you, that commander, he acted just like this. He calls 470 people together. And in the middle of the night at 9 o'clock, under spearmen and soldiers and cavalry, they escort Paul to Felix. You don't think God can take care of you? You don't think God can take care of your problems? Oh, friend, just read the text. God's got it. But you've got to trust Him. There's 3 things that will help you when you need to be sure that God's got it. First, you need to be encouraged. And the only way you can get that is to listen to God. Don't listen to the assumptions. Don't be led astray by manipulations. The only place you can get that is by revelation. Listen to God. He may speak to you through the dynamic of the Spirit. Some of us may say, God said. He may come to you in His Word. He may speak to you through a total stranger. He may be one of your relatives bringing you the very thing you need to know to get out of town. But be encouraged. The second thing, realize when God speaks that He is commending you. God takes care of us because He loves us. And when Paul heard this word from Jesus, take courage, He knew that God was going to work in and through the life of the Apostle Paul to accomplish Paul's purpose in life. So the first thing you do is you listen and you get that encouragement. And that encouragement becomes an affirmation commending you as one of God's children. And the last thing it does is it gives you confidence. It gives you confidence. Have you ever noticed that in your life? It's like someone reaches up and flips a switch. It can literally be that quick. You go from the pity party that you've just been having, you just cleared yourself a place off, and you're down in the dumps, and you're depressed and hopeless and without power, and all of a sudden God comes and says, I've got it. Take courage. I love you, and I'm with you, and I can guarantee you I will finish what I've started. The text says it another way. Paul records it for us. I am convinced that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion. Oh, folks, today we need to know that God's got it. Now, you're about to sing a song that invites you to give it to God. In fact, if you change what you put in the worship guide, I'm in real trouble. 'Tis so sweet to what? Trust in Jesus. That's what I'm asking you to do today. I'm asking you to trust Jesus. Why? Because He's got it. Thank you. It got through to one person. He's got it. You believe that today? Trust Him. And I'll promise you, you will be encouraged. Stand with me.